I love the LCK. Not enough to ever watch it while I live on the other side of the world during regular splits, but enough that I will eviscerate any semblance of a sleep schedule that I have in order to watch them win a world championship. What's up, guys, and welcome in to the World's Finals edition of the World's Pink Ward. I'm going to McNeil, the host of this show, and it's finally here. The whole enchilada, one big tamale, the prime rib, the vegan, gluten-free, grass-fed, all-organic, non-GMO, sugar-free ice cube. Whatever you want this meal to be, it's finally here, the World's Finals, and it's LCK all the way. In my last video, I predicted that we would see a T1 championship with a scoreline of 3-1 in this best-of-5 series, giving benefit of the doubt that Faker would get the MVP. I mean, he's the guy that everything's built this around. They have an entire brand identity built around Faker as League of Legends esports. Why would they not give him the MVP? So today I'm going to break down how close we got to those predictions and how on the mark I really was. So let's get right into game number one. Now, as it was with a lot of fearless picks and with this draft just as well, a lot of comfort, a lot of the overpowered stuff getting out of the way very early on. If you watched any of the Psychopathic Poro videos, he's in KT's brains rent-free right now. He knew exactly what they were going to do for the draft, how they handled the early stages of the game, the early priorities, how the game should formulate, but nobody could predict the T1 plot armor. Perfect got his Rumble. They gave Doran and Bessa. KT didn't care. And Dom got to play on his Ashe. This is best case scenario for the draft that KT would have wanted. The early skirmishes would set up and set the tone for how the whole series would end up going, with absolute chaotic cinema across the board very early on. Doran almost getting soloed in the top lane before 5 minutes. Crazy trades happening 30 seconds later in the bot lane that would give Keria a kill, and if he hits his flash Q, the entire fight shifts. Gumayusi TP's in to try to secure what was already done, and then ends up dying himself. KT would hold control over the early game stages, being able to secure the first two dragons, which is, as we've seen in Worlds, is a pretty good sign as to how the game is going. You get the first two drags, your likelihood of winning the game actually goes way up. They also would secure the Rift Herald early on as well, but the fight around the third dragon at the 18-minute point would start to swing the momentum to the T1 side. Perfect, who is so good at Rumble, we've seen it all Worlds long, landed an insane equalizer on the entirety of T1. I think it was 4 out of the 5 members, but either way, onto the high-priority targets. But after T1 resets, backs off the equalizer to re-engage, it's a massive sweep that removes KT and the dragon from the map in one fell swoop. A few minutes later, T1 would take Otacon in a wild engage from Doran onto the Ashe. Faker gets back, goes back to the base, TP's back to heal up, get his mana back, and then secure the rest of the fight and the objective from there. The rest of the game would look virtually the same, with T1 winning the fights, gaining control over the objectives through their sheer black magic that they have, and they would end up taking the first game in 36 minutes. Now, starting to wonder, when is KT going to start to show up in this one? We understand that T1's got the plot armor, and the challenge of the pedigree really came into Game 2 as BDD would draft Mel away from Faker. Faker had been the only player in Worlds so far to play Mel, so this is explicitly to send a message. And on top of that, their draft had a really strong versatility as well as a lot of good range that was actually a really well-done draft from KT. T1 also did have really good strength and potential with the Silas pick onto Faker and Sivir. You get late game, those boomerangs are hitting. But I've been incredibly partial all of Worlds to whichever team ends up drafting Nico, because the playmaking ability from Nico and the clones, we've seen it. Carrie has done it multiple times. Peter's done it as well. I tend to favor the team that drafts the Nico because of the effect that it can have. So with Nico being on KT, that's where my allegiances are going to lie for game number 2. And that's exactly how they end up getting first blood. The cheeky cannon minion defensive statistics tower dive that realistically is a broken element of the game, but they play it as designed, and they take advantage of it, getting the early first blood kill onto Gumayusi. KT would continue to progress their build and their lead for the next 10 or so minutes. A few skirmishes in between would keep things close until we had an Otacon fight where Faker would get a pick onto Doctum, and the fight would turn the other way because Owner's out of position, and the rest of it really just kind of falls apart. And T1 had this happen in more than a few instances where they think they're starting to get an advantage, they get one member chunked out or a member removed entirely, and then for some reason, one way or another, the entire back end of the fight falls apart, and KT would then take over from there. 5 minutes after the initial fight, and right before the Dragon's Soul would spawn, Doctum gets caught again from a Fog of War mistake, which was a horrible mistake. I don't know why you're shading to the wrong side of the map anyways, letting T1 get a massive advantage for free, knowing that they have Soul available now because the ADC is dead. KT recognizes this and knows T1 wants to go for the Soul, so KT rotates to Baron on spawn to force T1 to answer. Either you get the Soul, we get the Baron, or nobody gets anything. Well, KT called the bluff, and they called it correctly. T1 would have to answer to stop the Baron take from happening, which would allow Doctum to respawn, and no one gets any objectives from there.
And he has the TP.
So we continue on past the 40-minute mark where Doran would try some cheeky engages in the mid lane, a desperation play to try to just make sure that they can continue to stay in this game because at the juncture, KT had most control for most of the game. Doran's play did not work out. KT would end up getting Soul, their 4th dragon in a row. They would then pick up Baron as well, and they'd walk it into the base for a 40-some-odd minute win to put us even going into game number 3. Now, this is where we expect, and we knew as the series developed, that a lot of targeted bans and picks would start to have to dwindle out because nobody has a player pool or a champion pool like Faker does, and so we're going to see a lot more targets towards Peter and Keria as well as BDD and try to get Faker onto something more specific. There's enough versatility between ADCs and top laners and junglers that, yeah, who cares really, whatever goes. Faker on Victor in this game already has me skeptical because of what we've seen from Victor. And, like, don't get me wrong, Faker's the greatest player in the world. These players are all incredibly talented. I would never compare to any of them at any point in my life, in my League of Legends career. But Faker's Victor doesn't impress me that much as in context of this level of competition. So I'm skeptical because that means Gumayusi has to be the must-win carry scenario. That is their win condition to survive early to scale to late game. But still, from the draft, it looks like KT scales better. And Doran just doesn't win these. The game is the shortest list of notes that I took because of exactly what happened throughout. It's game 3, it's the middle of the series. You kind of start to tune out and just watch it play out, as probably what most of the viewers would be doing here at this juncture as well, because halfway through the video, we've kind of lost interest in the middle. So it phases out, and that's why I'm going to keep this game summary short. T1 had early objectives. They had control on Grubs. They had Herald, the first dragons. But like I said, KT scaling would just be way too much for T1 to overcome. They would secure Otacon, they would get the Soul, and they would get the only Baron of the game. The poke damage and the scaling from them was too much for T1 with how far behind they were across lane states and the fights, and KT would take this one relatively convincingly to put them on match point into game number 4. The opposite of where I thought we would be. I really thought T1 was going to be in this point up 2-1 going into game number 4. Now, we'll continue to progress with more targeted bans on mid lane as Faker would resort to his Anivia, which again scares me because it's a little underwhelming last time we saw him play it. But KT on the other side doesn't really have a significant amount of depth, and I don't know if unbenching the Kench for Peter was the decision to make, but it was certainly a business decision that he did. The game was a battle of the junglers to me, and by that I mean it was Cuz versus his smite button. Owner would steal the first dragon after Faker gets picked off, and the early game pressure from Faker and Gumayusi's Kalista would let T1 take all 3 grubs uncontested. Owner on Nocturne shuts the lights out for the second drag, but KT wins the fight after the fact. The third dragon goes the same way of T1, but KT wins the ensuing fight again, using virtually everything at their disposal, ultimates, summoners, everything. And because of that, that would put them at a disadvantage for the next objective, an Otacon that spawned in a few minutes, which, because of the lost resources, T1 secures Otacon. They would then take Baron on spawn, T1 being them, and end up with the Dragon Soul to put us into Silver Scrapes in true T1 at Worlds plot armor action for the Telecom Wars. What else could you possibly ask for than a Game 5 Worlds Finals? If you couldn't tell from any of my other Worlds videos, I love me a good Wombo combo. And Camille Galio just tickles something in my brain. It gives me the good feels up there. Gumayusi on Misfortune, Keria on Leona makes me think we're back in like Season 3, if anybody's even old enough to be remembering what the meta looked like back then, and I'm here for it. That's when I started playing. But when you put Faker on Galio, this is a whole different monster of T1. This draft was very hyphy, and like I said, I was here for it. BDD on Smolder is a massive late-game gamble that pays off if it does pan out, and T1 knows that. That's their late-game win condition. The game started out with a memo from T1, not to BDD Smolder, though, but to the Yorick in top lane. And it was a polite memo that said you're uninvited, as they made a point to ensure that of the first 7 deaths in the game, 3 of them were going to be on Perfect. The poor guy had no chance to participate, and T1 would try to get Doran his Triforce very quickly. He got it in 10 minutes, by the way. Mission success, and that would be a huge problem for KT. The biggest story of this game after the 10-minute mark, besides the deaths out of that, is that someone has to get BDD some help. Like, at one point, he held over a 2,000 gold lead on Faker, and the rest of his team was down, collectively, 11,000 gold. Granted, T1 Faker is on more of a support type of champion. Like, it's not a person that's going to go in and get the flashy kills and have the gold. So yeah, the hyper carry on KT that is Smolder should have the gold. That makes sense. But when the rest of your team is so desperately far behind, it doesn't matter how far ahead your hyper carry is in any facet of the game. But it was all pins and needles, even though there was a massive gold lead for T1. Because all it took would be a single failed team fight for BDD to take over this game with the executes and the stacks built up on Smolder. He played an insanely good game, and he, like I said, a single setup of a fight could have swung it entirely to the favor of KT, because there's a lot of bounties on T1 at that point. Unfortunately, he never got the chance. There were a couple glimpses of skirmishes where he thought maybe this is the point where BDD pops off, but because of the rest of T1 having such a significant lead, they would take all of the neutral objectives, they'd secure all of the fights, play their macro insanely well, and they would take the Nexus for their 3rd consecutive World Championship. Back to back to back. T1 walks away with a 3-2 final score. Now, I said it'd be 3-1 T1. I also said Faker would get the MVP. Wrong on both accounts. Gumayusi would actually be named the series MVP, largely in part, I would say, because of his Game 4 and Game 5 performances on Kalista and Misfortune. Did a ton of damage, was just an absolute nuisance and a problem that KT could not deal with. I'd love to highlight something I referenced in one of my last videos that had the positional breakdowns. I genuinely think, as much as I didn't talk about them, that Cuz was the better jungler in this series for 4 of the 5 games. There was the one where you can't hit smites, and there's a problem there. But beyond that, I think Cuz outperformed Owner and had more of a presence and an impact on the games than Owner did. On top of that, it really did come down to which top laner would suck the least, which is a terrible way of putting it. Like I said, these players are leagues above where I would ever be as a top lane main as well. Like, I have a lot to learn from watching these players play. But knowing that the top lane is theoretically the weak link for both of these teams, it's just a matter of who's going to have more of an impact at a bigger moment. It went both ways, realistically. Perfect had a couple of really good games, and Doran did as well. Doran on Ambessa was like a point-and-click ult onto the KT ADC. The match game of that was Perfect, playing an insane Game 3. Really solid Game 2 that significantly would help KT win those, just dumpstering Doran. I think Doran ended up like 1-7 or 1-8 on Renekton. Like, it was not a good game whatsoever. And so Perfect is to credit there for winning out of that lane stage. So massive props to both of them, because these two were playing checkers on an island life while the rest of the team's playing War Thunder or like DCS or something like they're in a completely different strategic realm than what the top laners are doing, as is the top lane life. So I got to give massive props to both of them, as well as the 2 junglers. And then, of course, the shout out to Peter for his international appearance on stage, playing as well as he did with the odds stacked against him. It bodes very well for a very young support in the LCK, who no doubt will have a very bright future ahead of him playing League of Legends. But I want to know who your MVP was. I want to know if you think they gave it to Gumayusi just because it's too obvious, too cliche to give to Faker, or what do you think the argument would be to have it to go to anybody else? Is the support ever going to win the MVP? It's like asking if a quarterback's not going to win MVP. Not likely, but there is a small chance. It wouldn't surprise me too much if they didn't give it to Faker because of what I said before, but I want to hear your thoughts. Worlds may be over, though, but that doesn't mean that my content is. I do still have a handful of videos planned for the next few weeks, so if you want to see those, please make sure to subscribe. Keep the notifications on so you get the updates as to when I do post those videos. But that's all I have for the World's Finals for now. Let's take a breath. Let's get our sleep schedules back together. We're going to reset, we're going to recall, and we're going to refill our wards. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next episode.